Hi, everyone. Suzanne Barnhurst here with your week 2 lecture in FD502. I hope all of you are having a good week, despite all the rain and the flooding. I've had some pretty significant issues with the thunder and lightning this week, and internet and cable service. So I hope you haven't, and things are going well for you. This week, we're looking at week 2, we're looking at the concepts of organization and leadership. If you remember, the text is broken out into planning, leading, control, organization, and controlling. And this week, we're looking at organization and leading. So there are multiple chapters through this text that are on those topics. Obviously, we don't have time to cover everything. But the chapters that I picked out for this week were chapter 6 on organization structure, chapter 7 on innovation, chapter 9 on individual behavior, 11 on leadership, and 12 on communication. What I'll do for this lecture is touch briefly on chapters 6, 9, and 12, and focus a little bit more on 7 and 11, because I see them as more significant in today's environment. Not that the other chapters aren't significant and the content in them isn't. They give you more of a background than what is more significant today, or what's happening today. So let's get started. In chapter 6, a little bit on organizations. Organizations, structure and design is obviously very historical. There's a lot of background to it. How did we ever get to a bureaucracy? How did we ever just start to transform to a more flatter organization? What are all the things that went into that? There's many designs for organizations depending on the industry that they are in. We're going to touch on that today, but mostly I want to just give you sort of an quick overview of reporting relationships and management itself in an organization. If you look at chapter 6, the first management in action was a story about the TSA and the numbers of people that the TSA employs and how they work as a group, but they don't exactly work as a team because each job is a little bit different. They use the example of the person that has to look at all the baggage going through the x-ray machine versus the people that have to stop you and check your purse or check your driver's license, all those different things. So there's clearly a lot of stress for them because, as they mentioned, there are harried travelers. I'm sure today, I haven't been on a plane yet since the virus, COVID, the pandemic, but I hear some pretty horror stories about waiting in lines and long lines, and everyone's anxious and nervous. It's probably 10 times worse than it used to be when all we were worried about was taking off our shoes and making sure we were only carrying 3 ounces of shampoo in our bag. So what they say is one of the issues with the TSA is the considerable amount of turnover. Now, they don't give an actual, let's see, turnover, there it is. Turnover has approached 80% at some airports. That's unheard of. If you're a manager and you have 80% turnover, you need to sit down and think about your organization structure and your management skills and the design. So what chapter 6 sort of talks about are what they call the basic elements of organizing. And we're going to look at just a couple of those now. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the chain of command. The chain of command is a clear and distinct line of authority among positions in the organization. All of us need to understand what the chain of command is so that we're able to do our jobs appropriately. Who do we report to? Who do they report to? Who makes all the decisions? There are 2 components of the chain of command. The first one is the unity of command, and the second one is the scholar principle. The unity of command says that each person within the organization should have a clear reporting relationship to one and only one boss. If you've ever had to report to 2 bosses, it can be pretty difficult. And if you've worked in an organization where they used a matrix design, that is a possibility. You may be working on a project. So you have your department, let me put it this way. Let's say you're in the engineering department and you have a boss. The engineering department may be working on a project with the finance department and the marketing department or some special other area. And then there's a person that happens to be in charge of that project. So for that period of time, then you have a second boss. And that's when things can get muddy and difficult unless it's handled very well and organized very well. Clearly, both bosses or managers need to be communicating with each other on the goals and objectives of the project and identifying the resources from each different division is key to making that kind of a design work. If you're an employee and you have two bosses, it can be difficult. It can be very stressful. All right, the Scalar principle suggests that there should be a clear and unbroken line of authority that goes from the lowest position in the company to the highest position in the organization. The structure must be able to facilitate the line of communication, and that's my input there. The structure can't facilitate the line of communication, and if the line of communication isn't accurate, then you're going to have issues as a manager. So it's going to be your job to identify what your boss or next level wants, and you're going to be able to communicate that to the folks that work for you. So the chain of command is an important thing to have established in an organization. If not, there'll be chaos. No one knows who to report to or what to expect. There'll be chaos. Okay. The next thing that we want to look at is the span of management. And that the span is how many people should report to a manager. There's been a lot of studies done with this. There's been a lot of talk about this. My experience in the past is the optimal number for people reporting to you is somewhere between 8 and 10. Again, it depends on the business. It depends on the industry. There's all kinds of things that can change, variables that can change that. But 8 to 10 people is approximately a comfortable number. Even though the span of management is crucial in structuring an organization, there's no cut and dried way to do it. There's nothing out there that says if you work in a hospital and you have a particular nursing unit, there should be X number of people. It gets awfully complicated. Some patients are more intensive than another. So they organize hospitals hopefully that way. If you need intensive care, you're in an intensive care unit. If you need less care, but you need to be monitored all the time, then you're on a different unit. So the numbers of caregivers will change depending on the intensity of the care. However, there's no cut and dry rule for that. And technology right now plays a huge part in identifying the span of management and what it should look like. Okay, tall versus flat organizations. Again, kind of organization in the chain of command. Tall organization has more layers. Flat structures can lead to higher levels of employee morale and productivity because the level of communication is faster and usually more immediate because there's not as many layers to go through. Many people believe that businesses can function more effectively if there are fewer layers, but at times, sometimes it's difficult to cut out some of those important layers. In addition to that, some companies have boards of directors, in addition to a CEO and other executive level positions due to the nature of the business. So flat organizations have been around for a while. There's a lot of pros and cons to flat organizations. Some people say they do make employees more happy. Others say there's more confusion and there's a little more infighting because everybody's pretty much on the same level. Okay, how do we distribute authority in an organization? Authority is the power that has been legitimized by the organization. So if you are a manager, it's because you've been given that title and you have legitimate power. There's two issues that a manager must address when distributing authority and delegating to people. The first one, and delegation. So the first one is delegation. The second one is decentralization or centralization. So delegation is how a manager assigns the work in his unit. It has 3 steps. The manager assigns a responsibility, and gives his subordinate a job to do. The individual is given the authority to do the job. So if you're given a job, then you need to be given the authority. That means you need to be able to make decisions. And then the manager establishes the subordinate's accountability. In other words, he says when he gives them the job, here's what I want to happen. This is the goal for the project. This is the goal for this task. That's what I'll look for as far as an outcome is concerned. Important information, an important thing to remember here is that the individual is given the authority to do the job. If not, they will not be able to accomplish the job. We used to say the worst thing you can do to someone is to set them up to fail. And if they don't have the authority to do the job, then you've set them up to fail. Other people would argue that we need to empower some folks more that work for us. There are many people that we still do call micromanagers who think they have to oversee everything and do everything. But if they would give the employees empowerment to make decisions and change things, do what they have to keep the process moving forward, there's going to be more satisfaction as far as the employee is concerned and more satisfaction as far as the organization is concerned. Companies like Ritz-Carlton, Zappos, I think Marriott is the same. They have policies that say employees are empowered to make decisions about customer care to a certain level on an everyday basis without question from management. So a good story about the Ritz-Carlton is when a woman came to the Ritz-Carlton to stay because she was there for a family funeral. And she was by herself and she was very clearly unhappy and distraught. And the Ritz-Carlton people went out of their way to bring flowers to the hotel for her and take care of her in a manner that only the Ritz-Carlton can do. But it's different than if she were staying somewhere else and they didn't even know who she was or why she was there or any of those things. That's one thing that they do. They make sure they know the customer and what the customer wants. So, okay, the next topic is decentralization and centralization. And this is just a term used by the text. Decentralization is the process of systematically delegating power and authority throughout the organization to middle and lower management. And centralization is the process of retaining that power and authority in the hands of higher level managers. How an organization decides whether to do a centralized or decentralized approach has to do with the external environment, the history of the organization, and the nature of the business decisions being made. Sometimes it's necessary to be more centralized than it is to be decentralized. In my estimation, centralized decisions power happens mostly during crisis times when, like what we went through last year with the pandemic. Someone has to step up and make the decisions about what everybody's supposed to do because every job has changed. So that would be an example of when we would use more of a centralized power. One other important thing as far as organizations go is coordination, the process of linking the activities of various departments together. So why do we need to coordinate? Well, I think it's pretty obvious why we need to coordinate different departments with one another. They all depend on one another for information and resources to perform their respective activities. You can't have a marketing department unless you have a product or service to sell. And you don't have that unless you have a finance department. So these departments all need to be coordinated, especially on any project. So schools is obviously another example of why you need to coordinate the different departments. Children can't go from one grade to another unless the schools are each grade level is working with each other in order to get the children to the goals for that grade and on to the next grade. Excuse me. Okay. A couple other tidbits out of chapter 6. Situation influences on the organizational design. A situational view assumes that the design for an organization depends on a set of situational factors. These factors can include the technology, the environment, the size, and the organization life cycle, how long it's going to be around. So the core technology is on page 160 on the checklist. And I emphasize this idea of core technology all the time because if you don't have a clear understanding of your own organization's technology, environment, size, and life cycle, you really won't be able to manage well. So you have to have, as a manager, you have to have a clear organization of that. You have to understand and be able to communicate that to your the folks that work for you. Organizational size isn't the size of the building, it's the number of full-time equivalents. If you see an ad in the paper and it says, we're the largest employer of people in the county, in Bucks County. Generally in Bucks County, it's a hospital that puts that in because they are the largest employees in our area. But that's what they're measuring, full-time equivalents. So they're not counting just numbers of employees, full-time and part-time. They're counting what they call FTEs, or full-time equivalents. In small organizations, core technology appears to be the primary influence on organization design. And, you know, it would make sense in a smaller organization. It's whatever the technology is that determines what the design of the company looks like. In a larger firm, the relationship with that is much weaker with the core because they depends on the financial side. What's their average yearly revenue? Then that's not as strong. When compared to small organizations, large organizations are characterized by higher levels of job specialization, more standard operating procedures, more rules, more regulations, and a greater degree of decentralization. And that's obvious. There's obvious reasons for that. There's more people, there's more going on, there's more output, there's more input. There's a lot more happening than in a smaller organization. And in our government's website on small businesses, the government says that a small business is any company that has 500 or less employees. So when we stop and think about that, that's a good sized number of businesses that have 500 or less employees. That makes them a small business according to the government. So any company over 500 employees is considered to be a larger organization, and they are, again, characterized by more levels of jobs, different standard operating procedures, that sort of thing. In the text prior to this, one of the things it talks about, especially for large organizations, are the the job enlargement, job characteristics, job specialization topic. Each organization, especially when they're larger, each job can be very, very different and specific, and these are the categories that are laid out in the beginning of chapter 6. Do you want to take a look at that? Okay. All right, so that's all we're going to talk about as far as the organization is concerned. Now let's move on to chapter 7, which is organization change and innovation. So in my mind today, one of the most important things that's happening to companies is the level of innovation and the level of technology and the speed at which we do business and innovation that goes along with that. Some of the organizations that you and I work with every day, and I shouldn't say work, have contact with every day, like cell phones, iPads, computers, your new vehicle, for instance. There is so much technology involved in that if we have a hard time keeping up with it, imagine what it's like in the business workplace when they're trying to identify what is the next technology going to be, and when will we get there, and how soon will it happen, and how much money is it going to make us? Because that's just the way business is today. 24/7, somebody can contact us because we carry smart devices and we all seem to think that we should be available. So, or organizations think we should be available. So it's a fast-paced environment, and in my mind, innovation is one of the most important things companies can focus on. Okay, so let's start by talking about a company that didn't focus on innovation, excuse me, and what happened to them. So the text opens up with management in action on the story about Kodak. I'm sure that all three of you are younger than I am, so I'm going to show my age a little bit here. But I brought a visual aid today. Kodak was the #1 manufacturer of cameras and camera pictures and negatives and prints and all kinds of different things that you did when you took a camera in the past. And when you took a picture in the past, there were no cameras and cell phones. There were no cameras that that were disposable or let's say there or immediate until Polaroid came out. However, Kodak had a let's see, they had Kodak went from being one of the top 20 companies in Fortune 500 for years, with sales, and then they went to a company with sales in less than $150 million, around 5,000 employees. This is because they were resistant to change. They did not want to change at the time digital technology came out for cameras and photography. This is one of the things that Kodak did. This was in the this was 2001. This was 2001, probably one of the last times I ever had a roll of film developed from a camera. And the pictures came back like this. You dropped it off at your local grocery store, and it cost $14.50 to have it developed. I don't know how many prints were here, probably 24. And what you got back was a sleeve of negatives. So if you wanted to have them reprinted, you could reprint them. And they even gave you, I don't know if I can push this out of here. They even gave you the actual rollback from your film, which is located right here in this little box with the number sticking out. And then of course, they brought you back your pictures. And I happened to be at a wedding up at Lake George. So I took these gorgeous panoramic pictures with my new camera. And you got them back like this in a pack. You went through them, you decided which ones you liked, which ones you didn't. And or if you were my mother, you saved every picture she ever took, even if their heads were cut off or her finger was in the picture. And you were able to save which ones you want. If you didn't want them, you could toss them, but you had the negatives if you wanted to make more prints. So back then they didn't even have the technology to make a print from a print. You had to take the negatives in. So it was process, but it was one very well loved by many, many people, specifically the folks at Kodak, who didn't pay that much attention to what was going on with the digital world and didn't really want to. This digital revolution, the transition from analog to digital, took off in the 80s and 90s. Kodak's problem was it did not move in the digital world well and fast enough. They didn't expect that someday there would be cell phones with cameras. They didn't expect that there would be the ability to put a little card in a 35mm camera, take pictures, download them to your computer. They just didn't want to go that direction. So unfortunately, they just kept digging in and saying they thought that their patent for film and development would hold out. And they actually thought they were going to sell it. And according to the text, they thought they were going to sell it for $2.6 billion, and they only sold that technology to $527 million. So Kodak is probably the best example of a company who eventually develops entropy and then dissolves, because they almost dissolves. They're still around, but they're hard to find. You'll see them. I think I see them at CVS the little computers they have at CVS so you can make your Christmas cards or print pictures, etc. Okay, so the question is then, why does an organization have to change? It's because of technology. It's because of innovation. You need to be doing innovation, excuse me. And it's because everything changes. There is nothing that stays the same anymore. So as a business, you need to be constantly scanning the environment. That includes the financial, anything in the external environment, the politics, the rules and regulations, for your particular industry, the community in which you're involved in, all that stuff in the external environment that we talked about last week is something that needs to be monitored on a regular basis. So organization change is any modification to some part of the organization. It doesn't matter what it is. The reason for changes, okay, I just mentioned that a little bit, are external forces. They drive from the organization's general and task environment and includes the politics, the economy, and the competitors. Internal forces such as the organization's strategy or cultural values of the organization, they can cause an organization to change. There's a couple different types of change. There's planned change and reactive change. Clearly, plan change is going to be better. All of us like to have a plan, and plan change is going to be better for a company. So generally, plan change is designed and implemented in a current situation in anticipation of a future situation. The text uses a really good example of Georgia Pacific, which received a new CEO and saw that there were a number of injuries on the job with Georgia Pacific. They worked with wood and lumber. And the number was pretty staggering how high it was. And then the new CEO said, well, we obviously can't have this anymore. So we need to take a look at this. And 26 deaths during the most recent 5-year period. So 26 people died in 5 years for Georgia Pacific. So he said, we need to change this. So he took a step back, implemented a lot of safety procedures, new protocols, all kinds of new and different things, and decreased that amount by a significant number. But he did it as planned change so that no further deaths could occur and no really big tragedies could happen. Reactive change is a piecemeal response to circumstances as they develop. So something happens and coronavirus, which is completely unknown to anyone, you sit back and you say, all right, how do we start changing things so that we can continue working so that we can keep our folks employed? And you do little incremental changes at a time, which is exactly what happened with the coronavirus. Now, and it happened to every business in this country. Not all reactive change has to be negative. Sometimes a business opportunity might present itself to a company and they see it, they want to seize it as quickly as possible, but it means that they have to make some changes rather quickly. So that's kind of a reactive change also. So they can be both positive and negative. One of the things I wanted to mention was, what is an internal force for change? And there's a list of different things that can happen. Currency exchange rates can change something. Your competition will do it. Technology can do it, but so can workers' attitudes. As we get a younger workforce, the attitudes of younger people are definitely different than older people, and we can't deny that. That's just the way we are. Then if the worker's attitude towards the job shifts, then maybe the workers' values were changing. They might demand different working conditions. And I know that doctors, for example, when my husband and my daughter were in medical school, both of them went to medical school. My husband's obviously older. They used to work on weekends. They would work from Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock to Sunday afternoon at 7 or something like that. That was the shift that they had, and they were in their internship. So they didn't have any time off that entire time frame, and it was within a hospital setting. Now they don't do those kinds of things in internships and rotations. They're actually more human. So they give people who are becoming doctors in their internship different schedule, and the hours are much different so that they can rest and survive the whole thing. So that's part of a change. So what are the steps of organization change? If you go to page 178, there's a list of the steps. I'm not going to read them to you. You can do that yourself, but there's several steps in the change process. It's no different than when you and I make a personal decision that something needs to change. We identify it and then we move on. You know, we start to identify why we need to change, what needs to happen, that sort of thing. But what is the hardest part of that change process? If you think about it for yourself, what's the hardest part about change? Is it identifying that you need to change, or is it actually changing, actually implementing the change for yourself? Even think about yourself. But what is the hardest part? I often think in management, the hardest part is the establishment that there is a need to change. Unless something significant happens, like the pandemic, sometimes it's really hard for managers to say, okay, we need to do this differently. This isn't working anymore. We keep trying the same thing over and over and over again. It's not working. It could be anything from the hiring process to something about the technology in your company. You keep having multiple breakdowns of a particular product. Then something needs to change. Is it the folks on the line, the way they're assembling, or is it some part that you're getting? But all that needs to change. But I think when it just comes to a change process, sometimes that's the hardest thing for people to do, is it's just admit and identify that things need to change. Okay, so there's a couple different things besides the change process. Then we move on to why people are resistant to change. Uncertainty may be the biggest reason, because maybe employees are resistant, but so will managers, so will everybody be resistant to anything that is going to disrupt the norm or the way things have been happening. Another reason people may be resistant to change is that it might threaten somebody's self-interest. They fear their job might change and they might lose power. They may lose some well-built relationships with clients. That was always something that happened to me when I worked in sales before I moved into marketing. You get your prospects or your customers. Mine was physicians at the time. You get those folks. You get to know them really well. You have a good relationship with them. You become a really good resource with them, and then they change your folks around. They shift everything around. So you have to start all over again with somebody else. And then eventually you get those people back, and you can't always just pick up from where you were. So sometimes people are resistant to change that way. Another reason people might be resistant to change is because they have different perceptions. They have different perceptions of the people who are affected by the change. They just, or who makes the change. So they don't look at it the same way you do. Some people might even have a bias towards change in general. They are very happy with things the way they are. I can remember when, this goes a long time ago, I worked in hospital, and when the hospitals first got computers, imagine that, think how long ago that was. They were very clunky. There wasn't a whole lot you could do with them, but one thing you could do was receive email, and then you can look within the different departments to get information that you needed, mostly specifically with patients. There was a cartoon that was passed around between everybody. That was a picture of a man in a shirt and a tie and a pair of slacks, like he was dressed for work. with both arms around the filing cabinet and his legs clamped around the side because he was not going to give up his paper. And I can remember clearly the whole process of getting people to get rid of paper. And clearly we've never really done that. But just the thought that things wouldn't be written down, that it would be in this technology, and if you needed it, you could go look it up, was really difficult for some people. Now, obviously, most of us we wouldn't know what we would do without the computer. So, all right. So how does a manager overcome resistance to change? Well, there's a couple of different things that can be done. They can ask the folks that work for them to actually participate in the change process. If they're able to participate in a planning and implementation, then they clearly will probably have more buy-in to it. They also might determine that this is not going to be for them. Many doctors' offices that I worked with when electronic health records finally became a thing in doctors' offices, or a standard thing in doctors' offices, many of the women and men who worked there, who'd been there, who were older, said, I'm not doing this. I'm too old. Seriously, this is what they say. I'm too old to learn this. I'm going to go. So they would leave. They would leave doctors' offices. So for a while, there was a lot of turnover there. But involving people gives them a stake in the business. Another way to overcome resistance is to educate employees as the need for change and tell them what the expected results are. Show them that it will help their job be easier. Show them that they won't lose their job if that's what their fear is, whatever those things are. Another way to do it is to make sure that you communicate well with the folks that work for you, that the upper level management, who's probably initiated the change, communicates well with everyone in the organization, and then specifically with their managers, and then their managers with their folks. Okay. One of the things that I went through in a hospital was a culture, organizational culture change, which was very interesting. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, a couple examples of how that really helped people move forward for change. All right, what are the major areas of organization change and the different assumptions, and et cetera? Most change interventions involve the organization structure and design, the technology, the operations, or the people. So if you're going to change the structure, one of the things that happens there is that you're going to change the way it does the jobs, or the way things, the basis of departmentalization. You might restructure departments. You might restructure reporting relationships. An overall design change, such as changing from a functional design to a matrix design that I talked about earlier, or maybe your human resources systems, where you add performance appraisal methods, or you change compensation package, which is pretty normal. Those are kind of the things you do with structure and design. As far as technology goes, a change in technology will affect the inputs and the outputs. Obviously, it will affect the equipment, the work processes, the work sequence. Affects a lot of things. If anyone, none of you are in medicine, but when an electronic health record is implemented in a hospital system, it's a huge project. And you can imagine all that's in the old system needs to be transferred to the new system. And it's such a big project that they usually only do it one department at a time, very small increments. I know there's some folks I've had in class before who went through it at Lehigh Valley Hospital. I think all of us have been through it at one time or another. So that's, you're probably very familiar with that. Another area of change would be people's attitudes and behaviors. It has to do with the workforce, obviously. Sometimes the way that can happen is by implementing new training programs, and sometimes changing the criteria by which you select candidates. Maybe you aren't selecting the correct candidates for the type of jobs that you have or are changing to. An organization might decide to improve its workers' performance, the incentive system. It also might be actually directed at the employees' attitudes and values. In many organizations, managers are trying to eliminate adversarial relationships with workers. It's probably the hardest thing to do. And usually when that's done, they bring in an outside consultant so that there's an outside perspective of what's happening on the inside. Re-engineering is business process change. That's a pretty radical change of an entire organization. That is, and you would do that to achieve gains in cost, service, or time. So it's not a quick fix. We could put the electronic health records right in that, in a re-engineering thing. A good example of one that was listed in the text and someplace that I've been is the Corning factory up in Corning, New York, which is basically right over the Pennsylvania line. And if you ever have an opportunity to go up there and see something fascinating, the Corning factory is pretty neat. It's been around for years, and their original, I mean, we're talking early history, 1900s, I believe, started with one man, Mr. Corning, making some sort of glass implement. I can't remember what it was for. And then some of you might even have grandmoms that still have Corning dishes. They made dishes, they made casserole dishes, white with little blue flower on the side, and they expanded into other colors. But Corning has been around for a really long time, but they actually re-engineered themselves. Unlike Kodak, they saw what was happening, and now they make thin screens for smartphones, all kinds of things for glass that the glass can be used for, but real strong and very strong and very functional stuff. Okay. Business process change. If you want to change the business process, which is different than re-engineering, the organization must set goals to develop a strategy for that, for the re-engineering. Top management must commit. It's usually accompanied by a sense of urgency because something has to change quickly, and we've seen this opportunity, so we need to take hold of it. Most re-engineering starts with a new clean slate. So they, rather than say, let's take the existing organization and change it, fix it up, they actually just trash the whole thing and start all over again, which could mean new equipment, new leadership. It could mean a lot of different things. I've often heard that when someone purchases a house and says, we're going to fix this one up, keep the bones and fix it up, that a contractor will say, you know, it'd be a lot cheaper if you got rid of it and started all over again. And that's what some organizations do when they do re-engineering. And a third, okay, so then the next way that I wanted to talk about is organization development. And this is related to what we mentioned earlier about organization change, employee attitudes. Organizational development is usually something that's well planned. It's organization-wide, and it's managed from the top, and it's intended to increase the overall effectiveness of the organization and the overall health of the organization. In other words, improve the morale and the attitudes. And it uses behavioral science knowledge. So it's not about widgets and computers and technology, it's about behavioral science. It's usually done with a consultant, in my experience, and what I've heard from other people. It's based on the assumption that employees have the desire to grow and develop and do well with your company, and that they have a strong need to be accepted by the company and by others, and that the design of the organization will influence the way the employees behave. So they might take everything apart as far as the structure is concerned, the human resource structure, and then put it back together a little bit at a time. Build new relationships, change old ones. There's a list in the text here of the different techniques. Activities can be used to analyze the current condition. So many times they'll do employee attitude surveys, interviews, and meetings upon meetings. Team building activities to enhance the effectiveness and the relationships of individuals. and help them to learn to work in groups and teams, because sometimes groups and teams are more effective than little individuals and individual departments that aren't working with each other. Survey feedback by employees, I mentioned that will help understand their attitudes and perceptions about the organization, and particularly about their manager. A lot of times those surveys ask a lot of questions about their relationship with their manager and management. Sometimes they'll bring in a third party for mediation or negotiation if it's really difficult and tough, the kind of change they want to undertake. Life and career planning is often added to an organizational development change because jobs may change and people may lose them. People may also be promoted, but they may lose them too. And sometimes they even have coaching and counseling on how people can better perform in the future, especially with the new new organization. So how effective is organizational development? And the text says this, and my own personal experience is the same. It varies depending on whether or not the organization believes in what they've learned and continues with it. If they just throw it away, then it's not going to work. And sometimes it's not practical. And I believe another thing is the commitment of the organization's higher level executives has a lot to do with whether or not the organizational, that kind of change occurs and stays in process. That has a lot to do with the higher management. I personally went through an organizational development program with a hospital that I worked with. It was a two-year process, and we started with one week long off-campus meeting, and then those off-campus meetings occurred, I think, 6 times in those 2 years, something like that. It might be more. There were different groups that were set together to facilitate this whole process. One was a technology group, one was a business action group. The one was a HR group, and then there was one called the Social Action Committee. And I happened to be a participant of that. And our job was to develop entertainment that would cohese everybody together so that we could bring people together that didn't even know each other, that worked for the same group, same organization, and get them to be involved with one another and build relationships, so that when we went back to the organization and we started implementing this new design, that we had some relationships that we could, that were established, and we could learn to work together. And that went really, really well. And it was good. A lot of the higher ups didn't continue to implement it, which was not so well. Some of them lost their jobs, some of them stayed and finally got with the program. But I think it was a very valuable process for a lot of people. And if some folks, or some of us, determined that once this was over that we didn't fit there anymore, then we had the option to leave, and they had the counseling. So I fortunately was able to stay, but not all of my colleagues did. Okay, so now we're going to move on to an important thing, which is the innovation process. And that starts on page 189. Innovation is so very important. Let's see where we are here. And it is the managed effort of an organization to develop new products or services, or new uses for existing products and services. Apple's a perfect example. New uses for a camera, but what do they do with their devices? Every 3 months, it seems, they change something. They make something better. They make the camera better. Now in the 12S, I think it is, there's 3 different lenses for the camera instead of just the one. So the innovation process consists of developing, applying, launching, growing, and managing the maturity and decline of creative ideas. Google, I wrote down here, okay, so that's figure 7.4. That 7.4 is the actual process, the development through the growth, maturity, and decline of innovation. So the key term here was launching, growing, and managing the maturity and decline of creative ideas. What organization have you worked for where your creative ideas were encouraged, where you were able to sit in a room with other people and just start throwing things out on the table and saying, this is, what do you think if we did this? What if we do that? And somebody else comes up with a better idea, and all of a sudden you've got a great plan. I've only worked at one organization that did that. And other than that, I haven't had the opportunity to be that creative. But companies, there's the one that comes to my mind the most is Google. Google gives every employee 20% of their week, 1 day a week, 8 hours, to develop their own ideas, develop ideas about what Google can do better and differently. And then they take that idea, once they have it developed, however long it takes them, to their manager, who then refines it with them, and then they get all of them get reviewed by a particular group. I'm not sure if it's Sergey Brin and his cohort or if it's someone else, but they actually review them, and many times the employees have come up with great ideas for what Google has implemented and what Google has done. When Google first started, there was no Google Docs, or there was Gmail and a good search engine, but there wasn't any of the enhancements that they have now, like the ability Google Analytics or any of those things. So that stuff all came from employees, apparently, who were given the actual opportunity at work to create, to be creative and come up with new ideas. Apple spends 7% of their annual revenue on research and development, 7%. And from Statista, the revenue growth for Apple from 2004 to 2020 went from $8 billion in 2004 to $270 billion in 2020. So you can see that 7% of their annual revenue was well spent, even though it was just 7%. So the innovation process can be very successful, and clearly has net some companies great success. Okay, so very briefly, radical versus incremental innovation, forms of innovation. Radical innovation is new products, new services, new technologies developed by an organization that completely replaces the existing product, service, or technology. Incremental are new products or services that modify existing ones. So one of the examples that I always use with that is your vehicle. If you buy a new car, you might buy the exact same model and company, but the incremental innovations are the things that make you bought it, because you have the old version and now look at all the bells and whistles on the new version. So that's an incremental innovation. Technical innovations and managerial innovations. Technical are changes in the physical appearance or performance of a product or service. Or managerial, which is changes in the management process by which the products and services are conceived, built, and delivered. So different innovations for both. Sometimes making a management change can change the distribution process and save the company a lot of money, because somebody realized that there was a step or two that was really not necessary. We take that out and make things more efficient, we're going to save some money. That's why logistics is such a big deal right now, because there's so many products being moved, and people have figured out more and better ways to get things done. Product versus process. Product innovations are changes in physical characteristics or performance of the existing product, and process is changes in the way that they're manufactured, created, or distributed. What happens when a company fails to innovate? Organizations may fail for what happens, but why do they do it? It could happen for a number of reasons. This starts on page 192. One, they could have a lack of resources. They don't have sufficient money to fund a program, or they don't. Another resource is their people. They don't employ the kinds of individuals that it needs to be innovative, so it might lag behind. So they need to look at their human resources process if they want to be more innovative and hire the right people for that. Failure to recognize opportunities. They may not invest in an innovation, i.e. Kodak. They didn't want to invest in digital technology. Resistance to change. Innovation means to give up old products and old ways of doing things in favor of new products. And sometimes people just do not. Too difficult. They've been doing things the same way. They don't understand the need for change. So how do you promote innovation in an organization? There are specific ways for promoting it through, you can give them a reward system. You can do it through the culture, which is what Google does, or you could do it through what they call intrapreneurship. So rewards can be financial and non-financial. Employees are different. Some people are all about the money and some people are more about the thank yous and the pats on the back and the, yes, it's on your record and we'll keep that in mind when we go to do the next promotion. So that depends on the people. So a reward for coming up with an idea is good. The culture of the organization, a well-managed culture, can communicate a sense that innovation is valued. That would be Google, clearly Google. Another one that I know of that I jotted down here is Zappos. Zappos is the shoe company who now sells a lot of other products. And Zappos communicates a culture where they want the employee to take care of the customer's needs, no matter what the cost, sort of like the Ritz-Carlton example. They also have they get a lot of input for their employees who, because they talk to customers all the time, they get some great ideas about what customers want, and they've identified lots of products that they didn't carry before that customers asked for, and that's how they've grown their business. So a well-managed culture can communicate a sense of innovation that's valued and will be rewarded, and if there's an occasional failure, you're not punished because that's a really big thing. Many people are afraid to take their ideas any higher up because if they implement it and it doesn't work, there might be ramifications for that, which is part of the culture, and that would need to change. Entrepreneurs are similar to entrepreneurs, except that they develop new business within a large organization. Usually an inventor within a company. Sometimes that happens in pharma when they develop a new drug, get a new patent. DuPont are the people that came up with sticky notes. One of their scientists was developing a glue that would easily come off, which you now see, I'm pointing to the wall in my office. You now see little things you can buy in the store that hooks that stick to the wall but won't take your paint off. He was trying to develop a glue like that. And he had the glue on a piece of paper, just like this little piece of yellow paper I have here. And he put it down on the desk, and when he went to pick it up, and he noticed it was glued, but it came off real easy. And now we have Post-it notes. That's where that came from, a DuPont chemist. As far as more entrepreneurs besides the inventor, there's the product champion. It's usually a middle manager who becomes committed to an innovation and works to overcome any organizational resistance and implement the thing. That, they see a better way to package something and do a product line or some other, maybe a service line, and they become the product champion because they're the ones that want to see it happen. And then the sponsor is the top delivery manager who approves and supports the project. Okay, so a question to you is how do we encourage people to be creative and think differently? What is it that we do that's different, that would be different to help people become more creative? And with that, I'm going to end part 1 of our lecture, and we'll come back and do chapters 9, 11, and 12. Thank you.